Hello, everyone. My name is Monica Williamson, and I am the Engagement Associate at SMU Data Arts. On behalf of our team at SMU Data Arts, we appreciate you for joining today's presentation on our latest research, The Alchemy of High-Performing Art Organizations, Part 2, A Spotlight on Organizations of Color. Before I introduce Dr. Voss and our amazing panelists, I want to acknowledge that we are still in the middle of some challenging circumstances as individuals and within our roles at art and cultural organizations. We are so glad to be able to connect with so many of you remotely in this moment and grateful to you all for joining us today. First, for a bit of housekeeping, we will and do have a number of guests here, so we're going to keep everyone on mute during the presentation to ensure that we have great sound quality. We ask that you use the Q&A feature where you are welcome to add any questions you have about today's content and the presentation, and feel free to add questions at any time. In the case that you have any technology issues, please feel free to reach out to our team via the chat feature. And if you would like to activate closed captioning that is available, simply click the CC icon or the More tab to turn on your closed captioning. You will then be prompted to use closed captioning via subtitles or by live transcript. You'll also see a subtitles settings tab to make any adjustments that you may need. If you need any assistance with any of these features within Zoom, please feel free to send us a chat and someone on our team will be happy to assist you. And finally, yes, we will have a recording of this webinar presentation, and we'll send you a link that you can review later or share with a colleague who is unable to join. I am so pleased to introduce our panelists. Snehal Desai is the producing artistic director at the East West Players based in Los Angeles, California, the country's largest Asian American theater company and the longest running theater of color in the country. Before his time with the East West Players, he was a freelance director working across the United States and in the UK. He's a member of the Asian Pacific American Media Coalition and serves on the board of the Consortium of Asian American Theaters and Artists and Theater Communications Group. Snehal found a home at the East West Players because he found it to uniquely stand at the intersection of artistry and social justice. Next, we have Demetrius Neely, who serves as the executive director and CEO of the King's Art Complex located in Columbus, Ohio. There, she oversees all operations of the King Arts Complex. Prior to her role at the King Arts Complex, she built a 22-year career at Nationwide Insurance, where she was an executive for 11 years. Ms. Neely believes everyone should have access to the transformative power of the arts and works to ensure high-quality artistic programming, and that it should remain a right and not a privilege. Finally, we have Steph Rosales, who is the CEO at Grandview Avenue Arts and Humanities. She leads the community arts and humanities initiatives in the Grand Rapids Southwest side. Steph has spent her time in Grand Rapids as a contributor to the city's creative landscape through creating her own art, music. She works with other artists and musicians on community initiatives and stays actively involved on racial equity work. She is committed to shifting power wherever she can and pushing against white supremacy culture in all aspects of her work. Thank you to each of our panelists who are here and their work within their respective communities. Before we jump into our community conversation portions of our program, I would like to introduce and welcome Dr. Zany Voss, the director of SMU Data Arts and the National Center for Arts and Research. Zany.
Thank you very much, Monica. A big thank you to the Wallace Foundation, with whom we worked on this project, to Steph, Demetrius, Nihal, and all of the project participants, whose wisdom is reflected in these findings. And thank you to all of you here who took the time to learn about this project today. You saw that this was phase 2 of a project. So why a phase 2? Why the focus on BIPOC organizations? It's because now more than ever, it's important to understand the elements of successful strategies that fuel financial stability for arts and cultural organizations with a mission focused on primarily serving Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, Latino, Arab American, and Asian American communities. The pandemic, police brutality, racial injustice, violence have all laid bare the inequities that these communities face. And likewise, research has shown that the field of nonprofit arts and culture has not been inclusive of communities of color. There remains a significant gap in racial representation between both the general arts workforce and arts audiences relative to the general population if you look across the country's arts and cultural organizations as a whole. And yet, there are organizations whose work is rooted in communities of color that receive far less support, recognition, and attention from funders and from society as a whole than their non-BIPOC peers. It's for this reason that we wanted to make sure we were understanding what are the strategies of high-performing organizations of color. We started this research with a question. First, we wanted to identify what are examples of performing arts and community-based arts organizations of color that have financially outperformed others in substantial ways. To do this, we first turned to the cultural data profile, the CDP, which is, perhaps many of you participate here. If you do, thank you very much, because without the data, we can't provide the insights. So we analyzed key performance metrics, or an ARC above 50 on what we call KPIs, or key intangible performance indicators, on at least 3 of the 7 identified financial health metrics over an arc of time through a methodology that's called stochastic frontier analysis. And what it does is it takes into account each and every organization's characteristics and its community's characteristics, because context matters. Context helps us to get to an equitable assessment. And because there's no single indicator of nonprofit health or performance, given the vast spectrum of priorities, we looked at 7 different metrics. The organizations had a minimum of 4 years of data out of the 7 years. And the organizations that we chose for this study all self-identify as primarily serving Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, Latinx, Arab American, or Asian American communities through their mission-related work. And so I want to note that for these first criteria, we looked at about 5,000 organizations and where they fell on the performance spectrum, given who they are and where they operate. And then we identified which among these 5,000 are organizations of color. So it's relative high performance, not just relative to other organizations of color, but relative to all organizations. Next, we asked the really more interesting questions. But first, I want to share with you who are the participating organizations. We have 11 performing arts organizations. You can see who the organizations are and which arts and cultural disciplines or sectors they operate in. The budget range, about $278,000 to 15 million, so some 1 or 2 skewing very high. So the mean budget's 2.7 million, but the median's only 1.4, and you can see the distribution here. In addition, we looked at 10 community-based arts organizations. Again, you can see the organization's arts and cultural sectors here. Smaller average budget size, 146,000 up to a high of 2 million. The median budget, or the midpoint in the range, is 468,000. In total, 9 of these organizations were still led by founding directors who had been in their positions for more than 20 years. It's really interesting then to stop and think about how can you understand the current day situation of the organizations without recognizing and honoring the context in which the organizations were formed. So in total, just over half of the organizations were created in response to a lack of opportunity in the community. 7 of the performing arts organizations were created to meet a need of providing artistic opportunities for artists of color where none existed. 4 of the community-based organizations were established to meet a community need where no local opportunities for similar services existed. The remainder were founded either by an artist with a vision or to preserve or celebrate cultural traditions. The questions we asked from there required that what kinds of strategies were used to achieve the financial performance, and were there particular contexts or conditions in which these strategies seem to be more effective. This meant talking to people. We adopted something called a theories and use approach, which seeks to capture the mental model of how things work from the perspective of the individuals who are closest to the problem. So it's kind of semi-structured interviews, each about an hour long, where once you start seeing similar patterns of response, you go back and confirm what you're hearing in the responses with the remaining participants. We conducted these interviews in August and September of 2020, so about 6 months into the pandemic. I want to share with you now what we heard. And I want to start with comments made by the individuals with whom we spoke, rather than just kind of starting in with the model itself, so that you can hear in their own voice why we came to some of the conclusions that we came to with respect to the model. So this is beginning where the arts leaders began when talking about the drivers of their success in their own words. First, community engagement is my job. Develop relationships across communities, develop relevant programming and client services that serve those relationships. Be purposefully relevant. When you build community with a group of people that have been historically underrepresented, it builds a lot of loyalty. Organizations rooted in their community are very valued because it's where people find their people. Revere your community. We build relationships around what the community needs, not what a funding initiative dictates. We've really built a community around outstanding theater and education programs. Artists want to work here, fans want to come, funders want to support it. If you have a strong artistic vision and have a strong social justice vision too, and are connected to the community, you can inspire artists who want to create relevant art. These are but a few representative comments, and you can see how, in essence, the leaders of high-performing organizations attributed their success to the alchemy between two essential common cornerstones: a relentless commitment to community orientation and high-quality programming. Therein lies the formula for strategic vision, or each individual's organization's answer to the question, how will you have created value and for whom? It's not an either or. You can have community orientation or high quality programs. It's a both and. And given that the unique mission and community needs vary across organizations, the way these cornerstones are interpreted and manifest varies from organization to organization. And it sounds like a deceptively simple statement about compelling purpose, but it has profound implications. And I want to point out that these two essential elements were equally underscored by those who lead performing arts organizations as well as community-based organizations. And for those who are familiar with phase one of the report, you see these same two elements, but in reverse order, because this is the order in which they were emphasized by participants in the two different phases. When these elements are in place, they pave the way for short-term tactical wins that inspire confidence and excitement. They build the brand, strengthen relationships with the board, with employees, with external stakeholders who buy into the organization's strategy for success. Early wins can generate excitement that reinforces belief in the strategic cornerstones and confidence in the subsequent roadmap. And so we often think about, particularly when organizations are closed, of when your doors reopen, what is going to be your early win with a community? There are external environmental and internal environmental factors that moderate or kind of regulate the organization's ability to translate the cornerstones into these positive short-term outcomes. Arts leaders spoke to a number of different external threats to their organization's ability to achieve short-term gains. They identified disasters and crises such as the COVID-19 crisis, and we know that the pandemic has disproportionately affected communities of color. We heard racism, gentrification, access to funding, and particularly lack of access to funding. I want to share with you some of the comments that we heard. Because this lack of access to funding really was a key differentiator, along with racism and gentrification, between the phase one and the phase two participants. Here's some of what we heard. Eurocentric organizations get buildings and resources. Organizations of color don't. Funding for artistic creation is given by budget size. No theater of color has a budget over 3 million, and until we reach 5 million, we don't get access to, among other things, Newark development support. There's an inherent bias against providing organizations like us support. We don't get EDI support, it's embedded in us. And yet large Eurocentric organizations are getting millions to diversify their programming, and then they call us to get our audience list. I'm very mindful of these relationships. The field funds the problems, not the successes. And everyone's running out trying to find a ghetto to serve to get the EDI money. It takes away from the organizations that have always done this work and will be there forever. We should all be treated equitably, but that isn't the case. So this is looking at comments that are related to lack of access to institutional funding. In addition to institutional funding, individual giving was also identified by some participants as a challenge, since the communities that they serve don't include a whole lot of high net worth individuals. And some leaders saw the connection between racism, gentrification, and access to funding as indicative of a broader threat to white supremacy culture. We include the three separately because I heard them separately, but just to keep in mind that it's really more pervasive. And it's really worth noting that in contrast to the leaders of the phase 1 research, none of the leaders in the phase 2 research mentioned declining participation as an obstacle. They are compellingly relevant to the communities. Declining attendance is not an issue. Demand for programming was never mentioned as an issue, whereas racism, gentrification, and access to funding were. In addition to external moderating factors, there's also some internal factors that were mentioned as being critically important. We heard over and over again the importance of a strong foundation being maximized when there's mission alignment throughout the organization that permeates decision-making. Strong cornerstones flourish in a positive, healthy culture that's built on trust, on transparency, open communication, participatory management style, and respect. As with the phase 1 participants in these research, these participating arts leaders identified the need to invest in professional talent and strategies in marketing and fundraising. These are the areas that drive revenue generation. However, many of the participants see their organizations as having insufficient resources to do so. In these cases, the insufficient investment in marketing and fundraising, it's recognized as an internal challenge, something that inhibits the ability to be more successful rather than an internal success factor. At the same time, high performance requires balancing this orientation towards true north and mission alignment with the capacity to adapt as needed. We heard that this capability is becoming critically important during the pandemic. And in a moment, when we talk with our guests about how they adapted and what drove their decisions. And then lastly, this multi-year horizon. Strategic plans are built on a multi-year horizon, but sometimes just in and of itself, the act of creating a roadmap to attaining or retaining financial stability feeds optimism. These short-term outcomes then provide a loop that reinforces the cornerstones for success. They also lead to intermediate outcomes. So what does balance look like once the organization builds momentum? Here, one of the things we heard is that these short-term outcomes can lead to deeper community and donor engagement, provided that the organization is continuing to invest in relationship development. And these deeper relationships then can lead to increased revenues from audiences and from donors, so increased financial participation and some increased organizational capacity. However, that can only occur if the mission focus of the organization, when the mission focus of the organization is really focused on serving a low-income community. So there's not a pool of people in the local community with a lot of ability to make higher individual contributions or to pay higher ticket prices. And when there's a strong lack of access to funding, both from individuals and from institutions, then the organization has a difficult time growing, increasing the financial participation, increasing capacity. They can continue to deepen relationships within the community, but simply never grow. This is not to say that this was the case for most organizations. In fact, most of the organizations had grown. We heard a lot of things like a lot of high net worth individuals in my city are donating to us annually now. And that wasn't the case when I first got here. We built that slowly and steadily. However, we also heard from some that actually do exist to serve disadvantaged communities. And for them, the deeper footprint of relationships, while meaningful to mission, it's not an engine for growth. And what's more, some institutional funders provide just enough support to help the organization remain financially stable, but their numbers and their support levels are insufficient to fuel growth. Now, not every organization actually wants to grow, but for those that do want to grow, exclusion from equitable access to revenue and capital means that many organizations of color that want to grow are denied agency. And I want to focus for a brief moment on this idea of organizational capacity. Across all participants in the second phase of this study, the top perceived challenge mentioned related to constrained organizational capacity. So widespread concern about staff burnout, low compensation levels, recruitment, retention, these are all issues that can inhibit an organization's ability to capitalize on short-term gains and serve an even greater number of people. Many of the organizations that we spoke with were human resource starved, and that's not because of a lack of talent among existing staff members. It's just saying because they need more of them. We heard also that issues of inequity factor into organizational capacity. We heard inequity also figures into leadership and to hiring. Because there are so few arts leaders of color and support for them in the field, we need to build our own pipeline and training. So these resource and these relationship wins have positive impact in two ways. First, again, they reinforce the community orientation, provide more ability to have high quality programming standards, but they also lead to financial sustainability provided the organization has discipline. Discipline to stay within its means, to diversify revenue streams, take informed risks in the face of uncertainty, and discipline to set joint policies and priorities in order to minimize the potential for controversy or for power struggles that might occur once the organization actually has more resources. Several study participants expressed that they have never run a deficit and they consider it a point of pride. And I want to point out that this model kind of makes it look like the reason for being the end goal for arts and cultural organizations is increased financial sustainability. But that's really not at all what we intend. Instead, what we really see is kind of a virtuous cycle where the long-term outcomes of financial sustainability support the ability to maximize mission success. Now, this theoretical model, it grew out of the interviews, and future research is needed to empirically test it to verify that these elements, as well as their relationship to one another, are really solid. But we did hear a lot of refrains from the first study to the second study, knowing that there are nuanced differences that we've talked about with respect to organizations of color. In the report, you're going to find in-depth details on the model, the methodology behind it, the study's limitations, and future directions. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because I have the great pleasure of sharing the rest of this discussion with some of the arts leaders who can speak firsthand to their model of how success happens. We have Snehal Desai with East West Players, Steph Rosales with Granville Avenue Arts and Humanities, and Demetrius Neely with the King Arts Complex. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I want to make sure that all of you have your sound on. We're all ready to get going, and it's really exciting to be able to welcome you here. I'm going to pose a first question for you, and it's really kind of putting it in a nutshell. What do you need to get really right to be successful as an organization? Like when it all comes down to, and you think of what is at the root of success, what does your organization do really well? Steph, I'm going to start out with you. What goes really right? What do you get really right with Granville Avenue Arts and Humanities?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. I think there's kind of like I'm going to answer that with two parts. I think one thing that we get right, and that I think is the most important to get right, is having not just relationships with community, but I feel like the term relationships, everyone's like, what does it mean to like have relationships with community? But to be in relationship with the people who you are coming through your doors, know the people by name at all leadership levels, board members, CEO, director levels, like knowing their story, and not just one person who then you're going to share out in the newsletter, but knowing their story so the next time you see them, you know exactly who they are, why they're coming in the door, why they're coming, what they have to offer. And really, I think through being in relationship with people, then you have a value shift where you're not trying to be someone or trying to match a service that someone else is offering. You are honoring the stories and the histories and the art forms and the expression of the community itself. So I think being in relationship with people, and then I would say too, like the second part of that is to know that there's never one right thing. Like I think being able to be wrong is the other part of that, and recognizing that institutions, there's a lot of work to do institutionally, and so being able to self-reflect as institutional leaders and say, hey, we got this wrong, our community needs this, or we heard this from community and we need to shift here.
I remember when we spoke, Steph, you offering the comment about we walk alongside people rather than come in with answers for them. And I really always appreciated that quote. Demetrius, talk to me a bit about King Arts Complex. What does your organization do really well? What do you get right that drives your success?
Yeah, I mean, I think much like Steph, we are of the community and in the community. And I think that makes a difference that you are centrally located to the community, the lower income community. It is we live our mission. I'd say that's number one. Our mission is we connect community through the arts, and we live our mission. And we use the art form as a way to connect community. So for example, with the social unrest this summer, we coined something called the heart, with the word art exploded in the word heart of protest. And we used the art form to have people, so that people's voice could be heard, because people needed voice this summer. People need voice now. We've always needed voice, but we provide voice to the voiceless. And there are oftentimes people have said to us, the King Arts Complex is our church, which is just a high compliment. But it's not lost on us, because what does that mean? What does that compel us to do every day? So I think, again, much like Stephanie said, we are of the community and in the community, and we meet people where they are. We don't judge them. If someone is in a tough place, we try to figure that out, help them walk with them, again, using the same words as Stephanie used, walk with them. And we try to use the art form to, improve and change their life. We know we change lives every day through the arts, transformative power of the arts. And so I think what we do really well is that we can meet the community where they are. People say it's all we have left, the King Arts Complex. It's our church. And we know that because we have a lot of individual donors. We have a lot of $10 a month individual donors, as well as people who give us, $10,000 a year individual donors. So we know we're meeting people's needs. And I think if we continue to do that, we will be okay, because we live our mission and people rely on it. And as I said earlier, it is not lost on us. We are compelled to do it, and we want to do it, and we're excited to do it every day.
And the go-to resource in Columbus. It's really exciting. Sneha, how about for East-West players?
Yeah, I mean, I think Steph and Demetrius really hit it. For us, it's a clear mission and mandate. So people know why we're here. They know our story. And I think the other thing is we strive to do the work, right, to get better, and are open and transparent about that, which often can be, messy. But folks, I think that's also a vulnerability versus kind of just, preaching from a soapbox about these things or anything like that. We really strive to model the purpose and activities and the way of operation that we seek for us and our community. I also think our ability to be responsive and nimble to what is happening is the other thing that allows us to continue being relevant and successful, because we're able to kind of adjust based on what we hear from our community in terms of what they need.
So you guys are, I remember you talking about really sort of hitting a specific community in the diaspora in such an authentic way, an authentic voice. Kind of on this topic of community orientation, because I know for your organizations, it seems so organic, and from the get-go you've been rooted in community, but there are a lot of organizations that struggle to figure out how do you do that? How do you go about doing more than just lip service? And you each have amazing ways that you focused on community orientation and relevance. I'd like to ask you to reflect on, can you speak to the relationships, like whether there are takeaways or strategies that you encourage other organizations to utilize when looking to deepen their ties with communities? Do any of the three of you have specific recommendations that come to mind?
I have a couple. One is it has to be a sustained long-term relationship that you're building. So I think particularly in the theater world, folks will sometimes do an Asian American play, and it's Asian American monolith. So they're not even acknowledging whether it's Korean or Vietnamese or Thai. And then they'll do that one play. And if folks showed up, they showed up, but they didn't. And then they'll move on next year to do something else in the diaspora. And then they'll be like, well, we did all that work last year and folks didn't show up this year. But that's because that was the Vietnamese community, and now you're doing a Thai play. So I think you have to really understand who you're trying to reach. You have to break apart the monoliths, and then you have to really commit, right? These things are not going to change overnight. You need to commit for 3 to 5 years or multiple productions. Folks need to know that you're sincere. And also, if your organization has not welcomed someone or their community for years or decades, you suddenly changing and saying, now we're doing work that's tied to your community, come in. There's no reason for them to come in, right? And there's actually a kind of there's a little bit of an arrogance, if you will, that finally you've opened your doors and they are expecting us to be there to walk in. I also think your board is a microcosm of your community and your city, right? So boards are something that you can curate and work towards. And I think your board has to reflect who you serve and who you want to serve and where you want to go. And then ultimately the big thing is budgets reflect your values, right? It's where you put your money is really where it shows, what you both serve and are supporting, but also what you're advocating for. And I think folks see that and know that right off the bat.
Okay. Demetrius, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Snehal said resonates with me. I think the other thing I would say is just to add to it is listening to the community, and this whole idea of being a resource. So to your point earlier, we are a resource for the community, and we do have mission creep sometime because there's a community need, and they're looking at us to fill it. So short of us, going out and doing something radically different, we oftentimes listen to community need and we say, yeah, we'll be the sounding board. Yes, we'll hold a session. We'll let you come in and do A, B, or C. So I think listening, I think authenticity, I think is really important, and humility. You have to be willing to, Steph said earlier, when you're wrong, you're wrong. And so you have to be willing to say, let us pivot because that wasn't the right way to handle this, or that wasn't the right program. So I think humility, listening, and just, being close to your community. We can't decide what programs and offerings they need. Let us listen and let us respond to what's needed. Try to meet people where they are. I just keep saying that same thing.
Great. Thanks, Demetrius. Steph?
Yeah, I think that just to kind of confirm some of the things that were said in the slides. I think the other thing is that, like, not using our organizations as through points to your relationships. And as Demetrius and Snehal were both saying, like, it's not just about like long-term relationships through programmatic elements, but it's also long-term sustained relationships with those community members. And the more time that you spend with people, the more you'll hear about what is relevant right now in a specific community. That same thing happens in the Latinx community. There will be, something that happens, and it's something from Mexico, and then everyone's like, oh, well, we just fold all of Puerto Rico, Colombia, Honduras, like all of these things, and think everything is a monolith. But when you spend time with folks, you'll hear more about the different cultures, what's relevant now. And I think the other piece of that is like that humility of, and what Demetrius is speaking to, when folks say that they want something, when folks are like, oh, this is the play that we want to see, or this is the dance that we want, to then say, okay, we're actually going to follow through and honor that, even though it's something that we're uncomfortable with, or that we have never shown before, or that we ourselves feel like we're not experts in. Because that right there is then why people will show up, because it's what is relevant to them. And if you choose that thing that you're familiar with, that you think is important, you're missing the mark. So.
Thank you all. I know that we'll probably have more discussion about community. I want to shift gears just a little bit. I had the pleasure of speaking with each of you, as we had said, in late August, early September, so about midway from the start to the pandemic until now. How are your organizations faring right now in this environment, and what has changed in your organization since kind of August, September? And then kind of, are there aspects of the strategic elements that kind of just walked through? There's a lot in there, but are there particular things that you've drawn on more so during this time? And if so, can you talk about some of the strategies and examples? And this time, Demetrius, I want to start with you.
Yeah, I think this whole idea around discipline around financial sustainability. So my board, I have to give them all the credit for this. My board came up with a fiscal policy about 3 or 4 years ago. And the policy included not just simply diversifying revenue streams, but a focus on our endowment. We have an endowment, and staying focused on our endowment and getting it to the goal line that we set for it, and asset protection, among other things. And so in 2019, we started this conversation about walking away from a theater that we rented, because it has been a drain on our bottom line, and tremendous amount of drain, financially, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so annual spend on a theater. And it's a beautiful historic theater. Anybody would love to have it. Great acoustics, historical value, community value, but it was financially draining us. And so my board made a decision in 2019 to walk away from it. And it was, there was some community upheaval about it in terms of, conversation, but we spoke with stakeholders before we made that decision. And then 2020 hit. And it was the best decision. It is as if they were clairvoyant, because we then were able to pivot easily during the pandemic from a financial perspective. Easily might be an exaggeration, but we didn't have a lot of hiccups because we walked away from that asset. Now it's a theater and we are a performing arts organization, but we still have a stage in the other part of our building. It's not a theater stage, but we know that if we need a theater, we'll just rent it and it won't cost us $100,000 a year. So I think this idea around financial sustainability has really helped us. And again, it's a fiscal policy, not just, diversifying streams of revenue. And so what we did with this part of our building that we kept, we're renovating it, we're repurposing it. We have a major investment in getting it renovated. And the good news is we did it during the pandemic when we were closed. And the other, by the way, is we haven't needed a theater for the last year and a half because we couldn't be in a theater. So we saved a couple $100,000 from walking away from that theater that we didn't need anyway for this last year and a half. So I just think that's one thing that sustained us. And the other thing I would say is that we have repeatable fundraising processes. And so when the when we coined this Heart of Protest movement, back in the summer after the social unrest happened, it became a fundraiser agency for fundraising. And we had an in-place repeatable process for fundraising where we have a host committee that includes high net worth individuals that contribute every time. If I ask 100 of them, 75 will say yes. So that was in place and we were just able to pivot on a dime. And so I think that has helped us and we will continue and repeat that. The other thing real quickly is being lean. I think about some of my peers were devastated by the pandemic, and that's the word they use. This devastates our budget. We're devastated. We're laying off 80% of our staff, but we didn't have all those high fixed costs and we didn't have a big staff. So being lean allowed us to be agile and pivot and be flexible. And because we all were already doing multiple jobs, it was no big deal. So I think that agility will serve us well in the future.
Thank you, Demetrius. And now I've heard you talk about running a lean organization as well. What were some of the changes or variation from September, August to now for your organization? And what are you drawing on? Like, what are the things that have kept your organization moving forward?
I think the other thing for our organization is that when we weren't in pandemic times, it was always, we were like treading water to keep, we were trying to keep our head above water, right? So you were just constantly going from project to project or and there was never any moment to kind of step back and pause and assess things and look at long-term strategy or long-term improvements and things. So we intentionally, the first half of the pandemic, took a little bit of a pause to do that, to look inside, right? To look at where are opportunities for us to adapt our space or renovate it or make some structural changes, but then also what is our long-term planning and strategy, which is really hard for, I would say, organizations of color, because it's both that you're just trying to get by on lean staffs, but you also oftentimes don't have the funds or any reserves to dream forward, right? So you're just trying to get through the week or the month or, let alone trying to look ahead 2, 3, 4 years. But that's so important in terms of knowing where you're wanting to go towards. And I think that's a part of the messaging to funders is also they want to know where you're going, but oftentimes you're just so fighting for survival. And so I think we were able to take that pause. And then the other big thing was we were really able to invest in our technology infrastructure and continue to do so, which is something that traditionally, not a lot of resources go into. And so I think looking at that, because now that we've made these changes to go online and become accessible in those ways, it's increased our reach and our programmatic opportunities. And that's something we're going to want to continue when we reopen. But again, that means that we have to expand as an organization to adapt, to include those. Otherwise, we have to take away from what we have. The other interesting thing right before when we hopped on, we were talking about, looking forward towards reopening and then how folks are reflecting back. And I think I am worried about a nostalgia for the pre-pandemic times that is emerging as a factor, because I think for most of us or all of us, none of us, pre-pandemic times were not good for a lot of folks, and so there's such an opportunity moving forward, and there's such an opportunity from the beginning, from the moment we're able to open our doors again, to have changed environs. But it feels like everyone is wanting us to go back, and they have this kind of rose-colored glasses of that time. And so I think being able to put in and implement changes now is going to be key, because as soon as the machines start up again, or the boat leaves the train leaves the station, whatever analogy you want to use, it's really hard then to change course or to adapt or to adjust. And so I hope in the in the next few months, as we start to look forward to that we stand up to this nostalgia, which I think a lot of folks have, and say, here is what we can do that's going to be different.
Wow. And I want to come back to this notion of like what has developed during the pandemic that you want to keep versus, what is it giving you license to let go of? But Steph, I want to hear, has there been a lot of either internal or external change for Granville Avenue since August, September?
Yeah,
What have you drawn on?
there's been a lot of both, but I think mainly we've drawn on our existing relationships with community. And I think in the general like funding and institutional, culture in Grand Rapids, folks have seen us as the people who are in relationships. So when the pandemic hit, everyone was like coming to us saying like, what do you need? What does the community need? Because they knew that community spoke with us and talked with us. And so we got a lot of support because we had those built-in relationships, and we leaned on that and stayed in communication with our neighbors and with other institutions and funders. And so even when some institutional funders were trying to pass through dollars to undocumented folks to help with rent, we were there serving as that, kind of like Demetrius said, like, even though it wasn't exactly like what we do, it's not our core, but it was something that opportunity came up for the neighbors. And so we were there to help make sure that happened. So we leaned a lot on that. And I think, Snehal's point about not going back to pre-pandemic times is really important, because the conversation has shifted. And something that I think it's a blessing and a curse is that after the social unrest and this like epic social justice movement, like historic social justice movement, a lot of people wanted to start having conversations about race and equity, and also came to us because they're like, hey, you guys have been talking about this for like 10 years now. Now we finally want to talk about it. And so it's kind of like before the pandemic, some of these things were not happening, were not in conversation. People weren't leaning on us for those relationships or those conversations. And now folks want to, but I think there needs to be support coming through there. And so that's kind of where we're moving now, saying like, okay, we do want to keep these conversations going, but also we need to stay lean and agile as well. And we need financial support to do this, because we can't do so many things. But yeah, I just wanted to call on those two things that the other panelists said, because they're really, it's what's been happening for us as well.
Oh, can I add to that? Because I think
Sure.
That's really an important point that Steph just made. So it's interesting, and I hope I can be articulate about it, because we've been in the work, as she said, for years, for decades. This is our work. This is where we live. And I feel like, and I saw this quote on the screen before we started, that there are organizations that are getting tons of money dumped into them to do, equity and diversity and inclusion work. But we're here doing it every day. We're not getting money to do it because it's not new to us. So I think that's interesting paradigm. The other thing I think is interesting about what she just said is, I am glad to consult with others on this work and what it means to do and be engaged in and be of this work. But also think it's difficult because it takes time away from our mission work to take time to go to this organization that we've been saying to years, you're being a little racist, to say, oh, now you recognize you're being racist and you want us to help you with that. But I've got limited bandwidth and limited time to do my real work. So I got to take time away because now you can hear it. So I just think it's an interesting time for us. Glad to do it, but I just can't give an organization 4 hours a week to help them do something that we've been asking them to do forever. Does that make sense to you, Steph?
Oh yeah, and specifically, other organizations get funding to do that work, and then call on us to do it for free, which I think is Zany, I know I talked about this at length when we spoke, just the culture of white supremacy that shows up in ways that are not like the overt racism, but these deep-seated cultural norms of what it means for us to be available to larger white-led institutions, and what it means for us to be doing DEI work versus them to be doing DEI work. And so really peeling back some of those layers and the cultural assumptions that are made about what we're here to do. As Demetrius said, we have organizations to run, we have the same work to do, but other executives or leaders lean on us in a different way than they would their white peers because of what we're culturally expected to be here doing.
I want to, you know, as Demetrius and Steph said, the other thing, you know, I don't know how it was for other organizations, but there was a little bit of it for us. There was a little bit of a pause until after the election, right? Because we would be in a very different world, right? It feels so far away, but it just was a few months away. And I think had the election gone a different way, we would be in a vastly different world, and our mission and our charges would be so different, because we'd be lining ourselves up for 4 years of both fighting and protecting our communities in, you know, in unprecedented ways. And I think the other thing is this time, I mean, we all serve communities that have in the last year and consistently been under attack in different ways, right? Whether it's immigration and undocumented, whether it's the police violence, whether it's the anti-Asian violence. And the thing is, we have been doing that work. And so there's a little bit of an expectation. And there's also, though, people know that and they trust and support that we're doing it, versus there's these organizations that have never really touched these issues that are trying to pivot or address them, but it's not been anything. They haven't established those relationships or that track record or those connections in the community to do that work in a way that you need to do in a fast, responsive, immediate way in the world that we live in now. So I think the social justice aspect has always been tied to the artistry for all of us. And oftentimes I say, you know, sometimes it leans a little bit more heavily towards this side or that. And definitely right now it's on the social justice side for all of us, as you know, until our spaces can reopen.
Yeah, there's a different tone of the value of social capital in Black and Brown and other BIPOC communities. For a long time, historically, the social capital has been where value is placed with social capital is with those who have other resources, you know, monetary capital, physical assets. And now there's a new realization that our social capital is actually worth something. So now we're being called on a different way, and expected to give up that capital without something in return, kind of.
And I'm sure you're getting offers of a lot more staff capacity to fulfill these new roles, right?
Yeah, right.
Oh, that's funny.
I do want to open the floor to our participants' questions as well, because I could continue this conversation with you guys for a couple of hours, but I want to make sure that we have their voices in here as well. Monica, can you let us know what the questions are, and if there are more that people have, to please go ahead and submit them?
Oh, yes. We've been getting quite a few questions. I have one from one of our audience members who is asking to the panel, what are your organizations doing to help develop and create a pipeline for arts leaders of color locally and regionally, including any work with students in university programs that these studies can help in their communities?
Would someone like to answer?
I mean, I'll start.
Okay.
Pipeline, you know, succession planning, all that stuff. You know, I was in corporate for 22 years. That's corporate terminology to me. Nothing against the question, because I think it's a right question. But that's, to me, it presupposes that you have resources to develop all that. What we are doing work in that area, and it is through collaborating with local artists, individual artists, arts organizations that are not that are struggling to try to get into this space. So, for example, we have several resident artists on our staff. They're not paid artists, but we provide them with space, and oftentimes we might supplement some of their programming financially. And so they come, so they get a place to do art, which one of our most famous local artists, Amina Robson, said artists need a place to do art. So we give artists with a place to do art, and we provide a lot of volunteer opportunities. And we also provide a lot of opportunities for them to come and do their programs. And, you know, we use them to supplement our youth education, our senior programming and all that. But I think about pipeline, meaning that you have this depth of people that you can pull from and you know, create leadership tracks and succession planning and certainly we don't have that kind of bandwidth, but we do a lot to help artists in the community.
You know, I will share that because there were so many founding directors who were part of the study, and that was just serendipitous. It's interesting that many of them expressed deep concern about succession planning. You know, they started this organization, they've been running it more than 20 years. Some of them have grown the organization, others really want it to always stay small. It's really a lot of variety. But thinking about the number of hours that they work and what the salaries are, you know, like how am I ever going to find someone who's willing to put in these hours for this salary with as much passion for this community as I've always had? And where do we find that person? Where do you look for them? There were a number of folks who expressed concern about that. So where is going to be the next generation of leadership?
Yeah, I'll share some of the things some of the strategies that we're implementing. I mean, I think the first step is like recognizing that some of these are institutional and cultural norms. You know, I'll always come back to the norms of white supremacy culture that lead us to believe only a certain type of person can do specific type of work. But if people want to do the work and are capable of learning, which most people are, in our community, you know, instead of being like, oh, how can we, you know, make sure we're connecting to folks with degrees and folks with this, we're looking at, okay, what is the work that needs to be done in leadership here? And what skill sets do you need rather than what degrees or what institutional and academic learning do you need? And we have kind of new policy and new recruiting around not needing specific degrees to be able to get hired into leadership. And so, you know, our focus is hiring folks directly from the community, hiring folks who can relate to the work and who are passionate about the work, and working directly alongside them. And being, I think back to Snehal's point from earlier, is being transparent about what work is needing to be done and how money flows and all of the things happening in the community. So it's not this paternalistic culture where we hold information tight and only one person gets to hold that information and that knowledge, but being transparent, sharing the knowledge, and inviting people into the work in a really different way. It's a different culture. It's not that corporate culture where you have this pipeline of people who like get promoted and then they're ready to learn. It's kind of, I think, reshaping that mindset a little bit.
Okay. And Snehal, at East West Players, how do you do talent development? How are you guys engaging in that?
Yeah, and I think it's different for, say, actors and certain types of artists versus, but you know, we say yes sometimes to our detriment to every internship program that wants to come to us. We only we only accept work with programs though that pay the interns or give them credit, but we do try to and now we've tried to expand those programs year round. The thing about internships is they require mentoring and oversight and investment, and so I think it's not just we're mindful of, we're not just opening the doors, but we're also making sure that we're setting up a fruitful relationship of growth for whoever comes in through those various programs. And then we work a lot of times with partnerships with kind of the studios and the networks and things like that, and get funding from them so that we're able to kind of set up programs that then they foster that also directly connect folks to people in positions of power who are making these decisions in the wider field and the wider industry. I also teach at USC, has a graduate program in arts leadership, and so I teach with that, and a number of us have connections to that program. But the interesting thing about the academia question is, it's as Demetrius said, there's so many things that people come to us for, and we have a certain resource limit. So I think there's a lot of folks who do want to write about our institutions, who want to do research, but we don't have the resources or the manpower to help support those efforts, which is unfortunate, because then what is not happening is a recording oftentimes of our histories, of our work. So it's a different type of invisibility or erasure that happens, but it's one of those things where we want to continue to strengthen and build those relationships, but that's not going to happen until, we have resources to be able to, move beyond day-to-day survival.
Right. Well, I think that's a good transition. Monica, I saw there was another question related to communicating to funders.
Yes, we do. We have, I think, time for one more good question.
Yeah.
And that is, what advice do you and will you give to philanthropic organizations and individual donors on how best to support your financial goals and endowments in the future years for organizations of color and ethnicity?
So I think it's a great time to be able to say, really, what are some of the greatest needs that your organizations are facing that funders may be able to support? Demetrius, what if we start with you?
Yeah, I think resources, obviously, we need all resources, about all elements of resources. It's certainly financial, but we need, as you said earlier, we need human resources. We need people who can come in and help us. I'd love to have an endowed position at the King Arts Complex where the development director, the COO is an endowed position. And so it's funded, it's always funded. But short of that, we need financial resources, we need human resources, we need technological resources, we need capital structure resources, we need all of that. We were talking yesterday about this, how different was this for us? And so Snehal and I just started laughing because this is where we live. The pandemic, I would say we have a rainy day fund. So we had fund in a reserve account, but we weren't prepared for a tsunami. So it's like, we need to be able to, build a support system that survives things like this. And so we do our part. We all say we stay lean, we're mission driven, we don't waste money. But even with that, your budget stays about the same every year. So how do you grow it and how do you get better at it and all that? So I think resources in all forms, and certainly money is at the top. And it's not money for the sake of money, it's money to fund needed things to help grow your programs and grow your organization so that you don't have burnout because everybody is doing 3 jobs. And it's because that's not sustainable. It is definitely not. Regardless to your passion, it is not sustainable.
Steph?
Yeah, I feel like I could talk for hours about this. And I think it's interesting. I'm not sure if the person who posed the question is a philanthropist, but there's a lot of resources out there for philanthropy right now. But we're asked this question a lot. And I think there's I feel like I could rattle off the list of things that we all know and say that we want all the time, like unrestricted funding, endowed positions, funding for endowed positions, and multi-year support. There are these obvious things that all institutions want to need. But I think the main thing that comes along with some of that is trusting us. And knowing that we are going to do right by folks and having a different relationship with accountability, and being in relationship with us to hold us accountable and to talk more openly about what's working and what isn't. I think there's the obvious power dynamic of philanthropists and organizations, especially organizations of color and white philanthropists. And so acknowledging that power dynamic and leaning into it and saying hey, I know this is real. I want to try and shift this power dynamic and have some real conversations. I know some of our supporters are trying to lean into that, and it's difficult, but I think that's the only way to really change. You can rattle off this list of things that we need, but if you don't trust that we're going to do right by the money and know us and be willing to hold us accountable when you feel like something is off, instead of being okay, send me the report and we'll never fund you again. But being in relationship, it's just such a critical part, I think, of the work that's necessary and where we need to go if we want our sector to survive.
And it was, almost to an organization, in talking about, how do you get to financial sustainability, the resounding commitment to discipline, to financial discipline, heard over and over again in the second phase of research. Any myths out there that organizations of color are somehow less stable, I think should be debunked through this project and through opportunities to just share what are the facts, what's the data, because there's no reason for the trust not to be there as solidly financially and operationally as your organizations are. So now I want to give you the final word on this one.
Yeah. I want to echo, what Steph was saying about two things. First, accountability. I think evaluating what are the hallmarks or benchmarks of success is, I think, key, because right now it's tied to reviews, awards, attendance numbers, box office gross. It's still very capitalist, and it's often tied to reach versus depth of experience and impact. So, I think that is one of the big things, right? So how can we look at the voter turnout that we led to, or the number of folks that we led to help be vaccinated or get tested to COVID, right? How can there be different benchmarks? Oftentimes our artistic work is not allowed to be funded or supported as social justice work, and it's all tied together. And we oftentimes have to cleave apart all those different things. Funding level tied to the size of the organization keeps us at the status quo. That is, I think, one of the main things that keeps us exactly where we are and does not support growth or reach. And then the two big things. One is, the relationship with funders. Yes, funders are very nice people and they support our work, but they're scary, and they're particularly scary to organizations of color, right? Because there is a dynamic, because most times they're white, but it's just, we know they're busy. We're afraid because the wrong step, the wrong word, the wrong call could, lead to us not getting that fund, which could shut us down because we're so always close to the precipice. And so being able to have close personalized relationships with funders that we're able to talk safely, and openly about what's happening, I think are key. And, there is no simple answer to that, but know that, we all, I don't know if it's everyone else, but anytime I have to reach out to a funder, I think 4 times, I read the email and I have other people look at it, just because we want to ensure that the relationship, and then as Demetrius said, any type of cushion or reserve helps us ride out the peaks and valleys and look long term. And most of us don't have beyond 1 to 2 months of operating cost saved up, if that. Oftentimes it's bi-weekly. And so the first thing to fund is some sort of reserve or cushion or safety net for organizations. It allows all of us to sleep, first of all, so we can do our work. But that's the only way we know we're going to be around in 3 months, and we can move our focus to other things.
But I promise this wasn't premeditated, but Snahal's last comment is going to transition. We're actually going to be offering, we just published a white paper that researches the liquidity, the working capital health of BIPOC serving organizations, and really kind of trying to dig into the issues, because in many cases they are actually more liquid than their non-BIPOC peers. But it's complicated, right? There are all kinds of issues that are going on in terms of not having as much organizational capacity, et cetera. Monica, I'm going to go do a screen share quickly and let you just share some information about that before we sign off. But I want to offer my personal thanks to you, Demetrius, Steph, and Snehal, for this conversation and for your incredible contributions and wisdom that you shared with all of us through this project. Thank you.
Yes, as that brings us to the end of our time together, on behalf of SMU Data Arts and our team that's been able to join this call, we want to echo Zany's sincere appreciation to each of you for joining this afternoon and taking time for us to learn a little bit more about this research and your organizations who are featured as a part of it. We do want to talk about, as a highlight, our next webinar that's coming up called Stabilizing and Restoring Healthier Working Capital Post-Pandemic. That'll be on Monday, April 12th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, and that is going to feature Dr. Zany Voss and Rebecca Thomas. We'll post the links to that white paper and this webinar within our chat feature. We would love for you to join us on Monday again for another really great webinar and conversation piece. Again, that's going to bring us to the end of our time together. Zany's placed a contact for us for any questions that you may have. We appreciate you joining us. And Zany, I'm gonna shift it back to you if you would like to end our time together.
Sure. I do want to say that this project is really has been a wonderful journey, and it's an example of how we can put data to work. I know that so many of you do complete the CDP for grant making organizations, and sometimes it may not seem towards what end. There's a whole lot that we can learn about the field that we can, I realize none of the organizations that participated in this study need us. It's really a chance for us to say, how can we help to provide a megaphone for the rest of the field to be able to share what these organizations are doing so well. We invite you to contact us with ideas for future research and invite your questions and comments if you didn't get to ask them to please contact me through email, and I'm happy to respond to you that way. And again, my sincere gratitude to Steph, Demetrius, and to Snehal, and congratulations on your incredible work in your communities and with your leadership. Thanks, everyone.
And we will now be closing our webinar space. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful day.